Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of American cultural history. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at popular culture as it played out on television in the 1960s. And as we'll see, all of the issues of the 60s appeared in the various television programs of that era. The clash between conservatism and protest and progress. Issues such as civil rights and gender equality played out prominently on television in that era. And so it becomes a microcosm of life in America during that era. At the end of the 1950s, television programs were rocked by a major scandal in 1959 when word got out that the enormously popular quiz shows that made up much of the programming of the era were rigged. By 1961, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, was scrutinizing television and the value of its content. In order to clean up its image, the networks responded in several ways. For one, they seized more control of their programming away from advertisers, who by the 1950s could virtually dictate the content of television programming on their own. Rather than having one advertiser support a single programming, and thus having great influence over that program, television began to operate similar to magazines, with many advertisers having commercials during one program, so no one of them had as much say. So the television stations and executives controlled programming, and advertisers controlled commercials. Television also tried to clean up its image. It began to air more public affairs programs, and tried to replace some of the earlier fluff with shows that truly addressed social concerns. In the early 1960s, a host of programs promoted social justice and helping those in need. There were several about high-minded doctors, psychiatrists, or law enforcement officials. In The Defenders, a group of attorneys handled cases about blacklisting, civil rights, abortion, and the like. East Side, West Side was a gritty drama introduced by CBS in 1963 about a social worker campaigning for urban renewal. Even a show like Route 66, about two young men on the road in search of adventure, often addressed issues of social relevance, such as one episode when the heroes helped to reunite an old jazz band, including some of the era's great black jazz players. Also paving new ground was The Dick Van Dyke Show, which began in October 1961 and created a new kind of situation comedy. It focused on a white suburban family and included much physical comedy. Other than that, its approach was novel. It showed much about the workplace rather than simply the home, exposing this once all-male preserve to public scrutiny. And its plot twists didn't simply involve the children and child rearing. There were adult situations with sophisticated, quick adult dialogue. And the couple showed a sophisticated understanding of the multi-ethnic world around them. The show also addressed issues of civil rights. But the lessons rarely cut very deeply. The episodes typically reached optimistic and harmonious conclusions. A similar description applies to the big westerns of the era. 1960s TV like Bonanza, The Virginian, Big Valley, and others. Occasionally these programs dealt with race or unfairness or bigotry, but the protagonists were often from the right class of society and supported big business and government. So, while upholding the social order, these shows may have encouraged some subtle change. Black characters often were dignified and articulate. Black actors of the era included Sidney Poitier and Ossie Davis. As the decade went on, television came to reflect the social upheaval and turmoil of society in general. Television shows couldn't help but be swept along in the changes in American society at large. Not least was the network news, which was expanded from 15 to 30 minutes in 1963 and carried images of turmoil and war and dissension throughout the decade. Many shows of the decade exhibit this sort of schizophrenic quality. In 1965, Bill Cosby became the first African American to have a starring role in a dramatic series, I Spy. Cosby's character was the social equal of his white counterpart, spoke 7 languages, and was a Rhodes Scholar. It was a novel position for a black man on television to be so empowered. 4 Deep South television stations refused to air I Spy. Cosby himself urged the show's writers not to directly address civil rights issues. Cosby had grown up in a tough neighborhood in Philly. He suffered much abuse in his household. On I Spy, he avoided any situation that would make him appear inferior. While he didn't consider himself a civil rights activist, he wanted to depict blacks in a new, empowered position. The Saturday Evening Post called him the Jackie Robinson of television. Television also walked a tightrope in handling the growing feminist movement of the 1960s. Some programs seemed to ignore it altogether. The Beverly Hillbillies was extremely popular from 1962 to 1971 and depicted a family of country rubes who strike it rich. In one scene, Jethro saw a magazine entitled Free Women. Upon seeing it, he announced, "I'm going to get me one of them." Other popular shows included I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched, both of which play on the idea of magically gifted, beautiful women, both of whom seem to be completely submissive and eager to please their men. In both programs, though, the women also push the traditional boundaries put upon them, as they have abilities their husbands do not. And especially in the case of Samantha on Bewitched, the woman seems much brighter and more capable than her husband. And on I Dream of Jeannie, it was Jeannie who consistently saved her master from troubles by wielding her superpowers. In effect, she controlled the action. Another groundbreaking show was Honey West, which for the first time featured a woman as the lead in a non-comedy show. Honey West was a no-nonsense private detective. ABC adopted the show in an effort to catch up with NBC and CBS in the ratings. In September 1965, Anne Francis made her debut as Honey West. The show took advantage of her sexuality as well as the growing sexual freedom of society. In one scene, a man says, "A woman's place is in the home," and Honey West flips him over with a karate move. At the same time, West is often protected in the show by one of her male friends, and her dating and sex life on the show was conventional. Unfortunately for the show, it was aired opposite CBS smash hit Gomer Pyle and couldn't contend in the rankings. It was canceled after 30 episodes. 2 years later, the debut of The Carol Burnett Show brought the first comedy variety show hosted by a woman to television. Her characters challenged conventional views of womanhood. She screeched, bullied, and manipulated other actors on the show. It skewered the typical 1950s family comedy. Burnett drew upon her own unhappy upbringing. Abuse, suicide, alcoholism, and so on plagued her family. To add a dark and cynical touch to her humor, on her show, single women didn't get makeovers. They simply remained miserable. She also benefited from a brilliant supporting cast, including Harvey Korman, Tim Conway, and Vicki Lawrence. Another cutting-edge show of the era was the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, starring Tom and Dick Smothers. They were clean-cut and started out as folk singers in San Francisco. They had made television appearances before. In 1967, their program was picked up by CBS. Their show included many barbed sketches against the Vietnam War, big business, religion, the president, and so on. Their guests included Joan Baez and Pete Singer and many other protest singers. Their show gradually became more controversial. By 1968, it was ranked 18th overall in the ratings and one of the top for 16 to 24-year-olds. But by 1969, the controversy was too intense, and CBS pulled it in favor of the country comedy show Hee Haw. A similar, yet more successful show was NBC's Laugh-In, which started in 1968. It was loaded with topical content, quick cuts and one-liners. An ensemble cast of comedians, including Goldie Hawn and Lily Tomlin, attacked the Vietnam War, conformity, and the church. The comedians at Laugh-In constantly battled with network censors. Still, for 2 of its 5 years, Laugh-In was the #1 rated show on television. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about the influence of television in the 1960s, particularly in one of culture's other mainstays of the decade, sports.